Perlibis just dropped the full hardware spec sheets, PC, Mac, console, and even a dedicated sheet for the ROG Xbox Ally. And honestly, I didn't know I needed all of this information at once, but here we are. So I do have questions. You probably have questions, and one of those questions is definitely, can my aging PC from 2019 run this thing without sounding like it's auditioning to be a hair freaking dryer? But we'll find out together. This is Mr. Rock.mol, where we back all the news and updates in gaming, and movies, and TVs, and so on and so forth. So today we're going deep on what Perlibis just revealed about Crimson Desert's performance targets across every platform, including handhelds, and asking the question nobody wants to answer out loud. Will this game actually run as beautifully as it looks? Or is this going to be another recommended specs situation where the recommended GPU costs more than my rent? And we all know how that goes, right? Alright, PC specs first, because this is where most of us live. Perlibis published 5 tiers. We got minimum, low, recommended, high, and ultra, which is already 3 more tiers than what I was expecting, and I appreciate the transparency. Let's start at the bottom, and I mean that with love. The minimum spec asks for an RX 500 XT or a GTX 1660. Pair that with a Ryzen 5 2600X or an i5 8500, 16 gigs of RAM and 150 GB SSD, and that's it. In exchange, you get 1080p upscaled from 900p, mind you, at 30 frames per second. Now, 30 frames per second on PC in 2026, I know, I heard myself say it, but here's the thing. The minimum preset is genuinely minimum. This is the floor. This is the game saying, hey, we see you, we know you haven't upgraded since 2019, we're not leaving you behind. That's, kind of wholesome. Now, okay, the juicy part, Ultra preset. This is where you need either an RX 9070 XT, which is literally AMD's newest high-end GPU, or an RTX 4080. For a CPU, you're looking at an i7 13600K or Ryzen 7 7700X. And in return, you get a native 4K at 60 frames per second. So look, if you have an RTX 4080, you didn't come here for an advice on whether this game will run. You came here for validation, and I'm happy to provide it. One thing worth flagging, the storage requirement, 150 gigabytes on an SSD, mandatory, no HDD support. This isn't unusual for a massive open world in 2026. But I'll be real, but if you're someone who still has a mechanical hard drive in your rig, I want you to know, this isn't the game's fault, it's just that your HDD and Crimson Desert are simply not meant to be together. It's not you, it's the asset streaming. The engine relies heavily on asset streaming for a seamless open world, so the SSD isn't just a recommendation, it's load-bearing. Analysts have noted that Gen 4 or Gen 5 NVMe drives are the sweet spot to avoid stuttering during fast traversal. So yes, 150 gigs on an SSD, clear your Call of Duty install and make peace with it. Here's what I think is the most interesting part of all this. It's getting buried under the spec numbers. Crimson Desert does not run on Unreal Engine 5, it runs on Perlibis' own proprietary engine, the Black Space engine. And based on what we can infer from those specs, it is doing things that Unreal Engine 5 games regularly struggle with. We're talking real-time global illumination, ray-traced shadows, ocean simulation, clothes physics, hair physics, and the game's minimum GPU is still a GTX 1660 from 2019. Unreal Engine 5 titles have famously demanded newer hardware to hit comparable visual targets. The Black Space engine seems to be pulling these simulations off with significantly more efficiency. Now, does that mean the game will run perfectly? Not necessarily. Tech analysts have pointed out that the engine handles ray tracing more efficiently than most UE5 titles, but we won't know the real-world results until reviews drop, which is one day before release on March 19th. So that's one day before, as in, you will have roughly 24 hours to decide if the reviews look good before the game is out. That is a very particular kind of pressure, Perlibis. Alright, Mac users, I have news. Crimson Desert is launching day 1 on macOS with a dedicated spec sheet using Metal FX upscaling. I know, I'll give you a moment. To be clear, when it comes to how rare this is, major AAA open world games launching simultaneously on macOS is almost unheard of. Apple Silicon support has been growing, but is usually an afterthought, a port that comes 18 months later, if ever. Perlibis has published a full Mac performance chart covering chip tiers, frame targets, ray tracing levels, and even OS version recommendations. The minimum is M2 Pro or M3 at 720-900p and 30 frames per second on macOS 15. The Ultra tier, M3 Ultra or M4 Max at targets 4K. And here's the spicy footnote. macOS 26, codenamed Tahoe, is recommended for frame interpolation support to hit 60 frames per second targets. macOS 26 doesn't exist yet at time of filming. It's expected to be announced at WWDC this summer. So Perlibis is essentially saying when Apple releases their next OS, Crimson Desert will support FrameGen on it. That's either very confident long-term planning or someone at Perlibis has a very good relationship with their Apple developer liaison. Either way, Mac users for once are not an afterthought. Let that sink in. Console specs. Let's talk about what's actually happening here. I do have a PS5. On PS5 and Xbox Series X, you've got the usual trade-offs. Performance mode gives you 1080p at 60 frames per second with low ray tracing. Quality mode pushes toward 4K via upscaling from 1440p, but drops to 30 frames per second with ray tracing enabled. Balance mode targets 40 frames per second. All fairly standard stuff for this generation, but the PS5 Pro. The PS5 Pro gets something called Quality Ultra mode. This uses PlayStation PSSR, that's Spectral Super Resolution, I've never heard of it myself, to hit 4K at 60 frames per second with high ray tracing. That's the mode that makes you feel justified in spending $700 on an incremental console upgrade. I just stuck with my PS5 to be honest, I didn't go Pro. I didn't see the need to. And then there's the Xbox Series S. The Series S is targeting 720p at 40 frames per second in performance mode or 1080p at 30 frames per second in quality mode. Ray tracing is off on Series S. Now, I'm not here to roast the Series S, it's a budget console doing its best in a world that keeps asking more of it. But if you're a Series S owner and you were hoping Crimson Desert would be your showcase title, I would temper my expectations. 720p at 40 frames per second with no ray tracing on a game that looks like this. Microsoft made the bed, the Series S has to sleep in it. This is the section I was most curious about because Perlibis did something unusual. They published a dedicated spec sheet specifically for the ROG Xbox Ally X. Not the Steam Deck, not a generic handheld PC category. The ROG Xbox Ally specifically. And honestly, that tells you a lot about where the handheld gaming market is right now. The Ally has become prominent enough that major studios are designing around it as a specific target. Now the Ally targets 720p at 40 frames per second using FSR3 frame generation. The Ally X can push to 1080p at 60 frames per second, upscaled from 720p in performance mode. Both figures assume turbo mode and AC power. Here's the thing though, if the base frame rate on the Ally is approximately 20 frames per second before frame generation kicks in, what does that mean for the Steam Deck? Like seriously. The Steam Deck and the ROG Xbox Ally have similar power levels, so if the Ally needs frame gen to hit 40 frames per second, the deck is probably looking at a sub 30 frames per second experience natively. The deck isn't an official spec sheet at all. That's not a death sentence. Optimizations happen, Proton compatibility evolves, community settings get discovered, but it is a yellow flag. If you're a Steam Deck owner hoping to play Crimson Desert on the go, I'd say wait for early deck-specific coverage before assuming it'll run smoothly. This is not the game to be an early adopter on without testing. So where does all this leave us? Crimson Desert is launching March 19th on PC and Mac simultaneously with console versions in tow. The PC specs are more accessible than I expected for a game that looks this ambitious. The Mac support is genuinely impressive and historically unusual. The console situation is roughly what you'd expect with the PS5 Pro getting the showpiece mode. The handheld situation is the biggest open question, specifically for Steam Deck users who are not officially supported and should wait for real-world testing. The engine, the Black Space engine, is the wild card. If it delivers on what the specs suggest, Pearl Abyss may have built something special here. A technically ambitious open world game that doesn't require you to sell a kidney to run it. And the no microtransaction promise, I'm choosing to believe it until proven otherwise, because the alternative is exhausting and sometimes you have to let yourself hope. If you've already decided whether you're buying on day one, drop it in the comments. Let me know your thoughts. Thanks for whacking. I'll see you in the next one.